The year is 476 CE. A Germanic chieftain named Odoacer walks into the imperial palace in Ravenna and tells the last Western Roman emperor, a teenager ironically named Romulus Augustulus, that he's out of a job. And just like that, an empire that had dominated the known world for half a millennium was gone. Or was it? The fall of Rome isn't a single event. It's history's greatest cold case. There's no lone gunman, no smoking gun. Instead, there's a long list of suspects, a cascade of failures, and a slow, agonizing bleed-out that lasted for centuries. To understand what happened, we can't just look at the final moments. We have to perform an autopsy on the empire itself. Let's start with the lifeblood of any empire. Money. By the 3rd century CE, the Roman economy was desperately sick. The vast machine of the state, its legions, its bureaucrats, its massive public works, required a colossal amount of fuel in the form of tax revenue. But the fuel was running out. The age of explosive conquest, which had funneled loot and slaves into the system, was over. Now, Rome was playing defense, and defense is expensive. To cover the costs, emperors resorted to 2 tactics. First, they cranked up taxes to crushing levels, especially on farmers and the middle class. This drove many small landowners into poverty, forcing them to abandon their farms or sell themselves into servitude to wealthy aristocrats, who, by the way, were often experts at evading taxes themselves. The gap between the super-rich and the desperately poor grew into a chasm. Second, when taxes weren't enough, they simply cheated. They started debasing the currency. A silver denarius from the early empire was nearly pure silver. By the mid-3rd century, it was basically a bronze coin with a light silver wash. This triggered runaway inflation. Imagine a soldier being paid in coins that were almost worthless. Prices for everyday goods soared. Trade routes, once protected by Roman might, became dangerous and disrupted. The integrated Mediterranean economy fractured into a collection of localized, subsistence-level markets. The economic engine that powered the empire had seized. While the economy was failing, the political system was committing suicide. The period known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century was a 50-year stretch of pure chaos. In that time, Rome had more than 25 emperors. Most of them were murdered, often by their own troops. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguards, once auctioned off the throne to the highest bidder. This political instability paralyzed the state. How can you plan for the future when your government might be overthrown next week? Corruption became the only functioning system. Officials bought their positions and then used them to embezzle funds and extort the populace to make their investment back. Public trust evaporated. In a desperate attempt to make the sprawling empire manageable, Emperor Diocletian eventually split it into 2 halves in the late 3rd century, a division that became permanent in 395 CE. The idea was to create more responsive local governance. The result? 2 competing power structures. The eastern half, centered on the new, fabulously wealthy and heavily fortified capital of Constantinople, would thrive. The western half, with its overstretched borders and weaker economy, was left far more vulnerable. That vulnerability was most obvious in its military. The image we have of the disciplined, unstoppable Roman legions was centuries out of date. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the army was a shadow of its former self. Defending borders that stretched from Scotland to the Sahara was a logistical nightmare. There weren't enough Roman citizens willing to sign up for a brutal, low-paying career, leading to chronic manpower shortages. So, Rome began hiring foreigners to do their fighting. Entire armies were composed of Germanic tribes, Goths, Franks, and others, who were paid to defend the empire from other Germanic tribes. This policy, sometimes called the Barbarization of the army, was a short-term fix with long-term consequences. These mercenary soldiers had little loyalty to the abstract idea of Rome. Their allegiance was to their commander, the man who paid them, and to their own people. This created a dangerous dynamic where the very army meant to protect Rome was filled with men who had their own agendas. Roman generals commanding barbarian armies frequently fought each other in devastating civil wars, further weakening the frontiers. The shield of the empire was cracking from within. And that's when the storm outside finally broke. For centuries, Rome had faced pressure on its frontiers, but starting in the late 4th century, this pressure intensified dramatically. The primary catalyst was a nomadic people from the steppes of Central Asia, the Huns. As they pushed west, they created a domino effect, displacing other tribes and forcing them to seek refuge inside Roman borders. In 376, a massive group of Goths, fleeing the Huns, crossed the Danube River. The Romans mismanaged the situation horribly, exploiting and starving the refugees, which led to a violent rebellion. At the Battle of Adrianople in 378, the Goths annihilated a Roman army and killed the emperor. It was a staggering blow. Rome could replace the men, but it couldn't replace its aura of invincibility. More waves of people followed. In 410, the Visigoths, led by Alaric, did the unthinkable. They sacked the city of Rome itself. The physical damage was limited, but the psychological impact was immense. If the eternal city could fall, what was safe? A few decades later, the Vandals crossed from Spain into North Africa and captured Carthage, seizing the empire's most vital source of grain. This was a fatal blow, cutting off the food supply and tax revenue that the Western Empire desperately needed to survive. These weren't just raids, entire peoples were carving out new kingdoms on what had once been Roman soil. But even this perfect storm of political, economic, and military failure might not tell the whole story. Recent science has revealed another, more insidious culprit: the environment. For much of its history, Rome benefited from a period of warm, stable, and wet weather known as the Roman climate optimum. It was perfect for agriculture, allowing the empire to feed its massive population. But starting around 150 CE, the climate began to change. It became more erratic. Then, in the 530s, a series of massive volcanic eruptions, likely in the tropics, threw a veil of dust into the atmosphere, triggering what's now called the Late Antique Little Ice Age. Tree rings and ice cores show a dramatic drop in global temperatures. For an empire already on the brink, this was catastrophic. It meant crop failures, famine, and social unrest. And with environmental stress came disease. The empire was rocked by devastating pandemics. The Antonine Plague in the 2nd century, likely smallpox, may have killed up to a quarter of the population, ending a period of growth. Later, the plague of Justinian in the 5th century, the first appearance of bubonic plague, wiped out millions. These diseases crippled the economy, hollowed out the army, and shattered communities. Emperors and barbarians made decisions, but so did bacteria and volcanoes. So, was it a collapse, or was it more of a transformation? The idea of a sudden, catastrophic fall in 476 is a convenient simplification. In reality, Roman culture didn't just vanish. The successor kingdoms that rose from the ashes were a hybrid of Roman, Germanic, and Christian traditions. Latin evolved into the Romance languages. Roman law became the foundation for many European legal systems, and the Christian Church, which had become the state religion in the empire's final century, became the single most important institution for preserving and transmitting what was left of Roman civilization. The survival of the Eastern Roman Empire for another 1,000 years proves that collapse was not inevitable. The East had a stronger economy, a larger population, and a capital city in Constantinople that was a nearly impregnable fortress. It had the resources and the leadership to weather the storms that broke the West. The fall of Rome serves as a timeless lesson in the fragility of complex societies. It shows how a combination of internal decay, political corruption, economic inequality, social division, can render a superpower incapable of dealing with external shocks, whether they come from invading armies, a changing climate, or a new disease. There was no single cause, but a slow, systemic failure. Rome wasn't murdered, it died of 1,000 cuts.
Thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, and hit noti bell for daily videos.